Yesterday, we began to examine the decline of Puritanism in America, particularly in New England, and what caused that decline. Do you remember what the first cause was, without looking? What was the first cause of decline? Materialism, right. And what was the second cause? Michaela? Unconverted church members, which came about largely because of what agreement?
The halfway covenant.
Right, the halfway covenant. Now, today we're going to begin looking at another cause for the decline of Puritanism, and this is going to take a couple of days for us to examine, because we're going to look at it in detail, and that is the Salem witch trials. There were several prior events that led up to the Salem witch trials. One of the most misunderstood events in American history. Everybody probably knows something about the Salem witch trials. The question is the something they know accurate? And we're going to look at it and see what really happened and the explanation for it.
I just think of like horror whenever I hear Salem witch trials.
Yeah, I'm sure there've been a lot of movies made that have made it out to be kind of a horror movie and scary, things like that. There was a play written once called The Crucible, which purported to portray what happened at the Salem witch trial, but in reality it didn't. It changed a lot of things because the author had an agenda, and I don't think you would understand his agenda, but it was to criticize those that were trying to root out communism in our government following World War II, early Cold War, and compare that to witch hunters. And of course, in his portrayal, didn't believe that there really were such things as witches. Okay, so we're going to look at what happened. In fact, at one point we're going to be looking at primary source material, actually read part of the trial testimony. All right? So, but there are several things that lead up to the Salem witch trials. It wasn't something that just happened in a vacuum. First, there was spiritual decline in New England due to measures such as the halfway covenant. We've already talked about that. So spiritually, churches were going downhill because there were so many unconverted church members in the churches. Secondly, there was a more of a political nature, and that is Massachusetts lost its charter in 1684. Do you remember that charter? Do you remember way back when I told you about Massachusetts Bay Company received a charter from the king to establish a colony in Massachusetts? Do you remember what was different about that charter than other charters?
They didn't have to have somebody in England.
Yeah. So they had the charter in Massachusetts, but the king negated it, said no. In fact, they were so afraid that they might actually come and try to take the actual charter that somebody went out and hid it in an oak tree, on a hollow tree, and put it in there for safekeeping. Because legally, that's what they were to be governed by. But the king took away their charter, and as he did that, that left the Massachusetts colony in a state of flux, because technically there's no government. He eliminates the charter, but he doesn't bring anybody else in quite yet. And so in between time, there is no real government and no judicial system. The colonists ceased to have any legal right to their lands, and it left them without a court system. Increase Mather, the father of Cotton Mather, had sailed to London to obtain a new charter. In the middle of May, he returned from England. With him was the new charter and one other person, a new governor, not selected by the people of Massachusetts, appointed by the king. And his name was Sir William Phipps. The new governor, however, was a man that was respected by the Puritans. He was a man that Cotton Mather had personally baptized and was one of Cotton's dearest friends. So they did trust him. As far as governors go, the king appointed, this was a good choice. But Massachusetts had been without a governor since 1689. Since that time, without a legal government, there could only be preliminary examinations, not trials. In other words, they could only make, like a grand jury would today, examine the case to see if there's a reason to have a trial. They could do that, but they couldn't actually have a trial of accused witches. That was soon to change. Now that Increase Mather had returned with the new charter, Massachusetts was no longer a colony, but an official province of England. However, as advantageous as this may appear for all concerned, it had dire drawbacks for the more affluent Puritans. The new charter decreed that Puritans, quote, could no longer enforce Puritan worship on the populace or outlaw other religions, unquote. So that kind of blows away the whole city on a hill deal, doesn't it? It blows away the whole idea we're in a covenant with God with one another to establish a community which is dedicated to God. Now the king says, no, you have to allow other religions too, which would include Quakers, whom they were more than pleased to hang when they tried to come in and disrupt things. Now, instead of only male church members being allowed to vote, all male property owners had that privilege. So, big changes taking place politically. All right? So, there's been spiritual change and a big political change. The third thing that happened before the trials that seems to have an effect on people is that there have been recent droughts and illnesses. As Increase Mather was gone, there have been more immediate concerns in Massachusetts than the government. Smallpox epidemics have broken out. So there was a concern with even staying alive as disease and as they didn't receive rain for their crops. The fourth preliminary aspect of these trials is the threat of Indian attacks. Indian raids were on the rise. In fact, 2 years after this, there were two communities that were attacked, and in one, 90 colonists were killed, and another 21 colonists. So there's a lot going on here as we get to this. And you know, when there's a lot of negative things happening, that tends to influence people's attitudes, just like you heard this morning in chapel. All right, now, any questions about these four things that were occurring, these four events that had been occurring before we get to the Salem witch trials? All right, you can hopefully you can see how this may have framed some attitudes that the people had. Now, when we talk about the Salem witch trials, there are different explanations as to what happened. And I'm going to give you the various explanations. I'm not going to tell you which one is the correct one. I want you to think about these as we go through the evidence. And hopefully the evidence will make it clear to you which of these explanations is the real one. Is somebody sitting in that seat? Nobody? Hayden, come up here. Maybe you can stay awake. You're up in the front. If you can, I'll get close enough to spit on you when I'm talking. All right, explanations for what happened. First is, there's two categories. First of all, is the natural explanation, and there are several different under that. So under natural explanations, we have what's called the psychological explanation. And what this means is that the whole episode of the Salem witch trials was caused by fear or youth mania, they called it, or we would call it teenage rebellion, or fraud, or delusions of grandeur. You know, that's a psychological term to indicate that people think more highly of themselves than they ought to think, as it says in the Bible, that people become prideful. And so those that follow the psychological explanation would say that the girls involved had ideas of controlling the the settlement of doing things that were in rebellion against their parents and all of that. So that's the psychological explanation. The second natural explanation, and that's a picture indicating psychological. I don't know why, I just thought it was a cool picture. Indicates how their minds are all mixed up. The second explanation of a natural variety is sociological. People point out that there was a lot of social hostility. There were bad feelings between people in the settlement. There were family disputes. There was a breakdown of New England's system of social classifications. So in other words, there was a breakdown of who were the social elite and those that were under them. Someone said that perhaps it all happened because communities under stress sometimes go mad. They search for a scapegoat, usually someone who does not fit accepted norms, to take the blame for their problems. So part of this sociological explanation is that there were people that in the community which desired land that other people owned, and the Salem witch trials was a way to acquire that land by accusing other people of being a witch. Then they could get their land, and so there was this bad blood between several families in the community. That's the sociological explanation. The third and final natural explanation is called the medical explanation. Some people point out that mental, emotional disorders such as mass hysteria or mental illness, and in physical disorders such as ergo poisoning, which is a type of fungus, or Jimson weed poisoning. Some have suggested maybe they just got into some bad mushrooms. And so the girls were hallucinating and talking about the spirits they saw and seeing witches. So the medical explanation is that there is either mass hysteria. Some have suggested that some of the seed that they were using for food may have gotten a fungus in it, and that may have caused people to kind of hallucinate and go crazy. All right, and of course, mass hysteria is something that maybe that fits more in psychological even, because mass hysteria is more of a psychological event where one person gets upset and another person gets upset because they're upset. It just kind of spreads. I saw that happen once in a school I taught in amongst some junior high girls. I have no idea how it started, but one girl started hyperventilating, and pretty soon, by like an hour or two later, we had 10 or 15 girls sitting in the multi-purpose room with paper bags and blowing in and out of them. And if you asked any of them, why are you hyperventilating? They had no idea, except the other ones were, and so they started doing it too. So that may be one explanation as to what happened. All right. So these are all the natural explanations of the Salem witch trials. Now, why are they called natural explanations? Because it is a way to look at the Salem witch trials without acknowledging another explanation, and that is the supernatural explanation. The supernatural explanation is simply that what happened was a satanic manipulation of the phenomena, that it was not necessarily witchcraft, but that Satan was using some things that were going on there to bring about disorder, to bring about chaos. And rather than scare you with a picture of a demon, actually this is a picture of a demon, but it's a friendly-looking demon, which is oftentimes how we appear. That is a genie, as you know, for Latin. A genie, or jinn, in the Arabic and the Muslim world, is a demon. So next time you see Aladdin and this funny, friendly genie, remember what he really is. Okay, so those are the choices. So as we go through, decide, was it psychological, was it sociological, was it medical, or was it supernatural, or even a combination of those things. All right, next we're going to look at the events themselves. First, by looking at the context. Part of the problem in looking back at history and evaluating what people did and why they did it, we do so from the perspective of us. And sometimes we make judgments on people that are not really fair because they lived in a different time, did not have the same ideas or the same perspectives that we have. You know, for example, many of you pointed out you didn't like how the Puritans treated women. But in their time, they treated women better than anybody else did. And yet you thought it was bad. But you know, that's because we're imposing our ideas upon a different time period. And this happens with the Salem witch trials. We look at that and say, how awful that anyone accuse anybody else of being a witch. I mean, everybody knows that witches aren't real. And all that. So how awful. But in the context, what happened at Salem was not unique. Witchcraft and accusations of witchcraft were not simply something that happened in 1692 or something that happened only in Salem, Massachusetts. There were 95 incidents of witchcraft in the colonies before 1692. 95. And there were 58 trials for witchcraft between 1660 and 1692 in New England alone. 58 trials in different places. Salem was not an isolated incident. This was not unusual for there to be trials for witchcraft. All right, so that's the context. Now let's look next at the affliction of the girls. The situation is this. And it's under the title Tituba and the Circle of Girls. In the long winter of 1691 to 1692, a small group of girls was meeting one evening a week in the home of Salem's pastor, Reverend Samuel Parris. Were they meeting for Bible study? No. That would have been a good thing. But they were meeting to learn what magic this Western Indian slave woman could teach them. Tituba was originally from the West Indies, and she knew about magic. She knew about witchcraft. Her father was a witch doctor, and so she knew how to do different things in the magic realm. And so these girls were gathering together to hear things from her and to learn from her what they could about magic. The group included, and I think I have their names listed for you there and their ages, just because I want you to see the spectrum around which these girls were there. First of all, there's Abigail Williams, 11 years old, Mary Walcott, 17 years old, Ann Putnam, 12, Mercy Lewis, 17, Mary Warren, 20, Elizabeth Booth, 18, Sarah Churchill, 20, and Susanna Sheldon, 20. Now, what would you say about the ages of the girls that were there? What do you observe about their ages? Lahana?
They were pretty young.
Well, some of them were pretty, what do you consider pretty young?
Like
Before they were married, yeah. But how many of you are 17? How many of you are 20? 18? So you're younger than most of these girls were, right? Most of them were 17 and older. You have an 11-year-old and 12-year-old. So, and that was a couple years ago for all of you, right? Nobody 12 in here. So some of you may act 12, but you're older than 12. So you're in between the ages of the last girls. So these are girls that are really older teenagers, at least, for the most part. All right, on the occasions when the elder Harrises, that is the pastor and his wife, were absent, Tituba, the West Indian slave woman, whose father was a practicing voodoo witch doctor, quote, yielded to the temptation to show the children tucks and spells, fragments of something like voodoo remembered from the Barbados, unquote. Well, one of the things that girls were interested in knowing was their future. I won't ask you if you've ever participated, but let me ask you, have you known of people that have participated, young people, around trying to find out their future? Either a crystal ball, a Ouija board, things like that, or cards. Have you known some people like that? Yeah. It's a kind of a natural thing. We want to know what the future is, right? So these girls were gathered around Tituba, and they wanted to know what their future. One of them attempted to find her future husband's occupation with the use of an egg and a glass. Something appeared to her. It appeared, and we use the word specter a lot because that's the word they use. Specter simply means spirit, ghost-like. There appeared to her a specter in the likeness of a coffin. In other words, there appeared to her in the room a coffin suddenly, causing her no small amount of consternation. She wants to know about her future husband, and a coffin appears. In fact, she was the recipient of demonic oppression from that time until her death, dying a single person, being afraid to wed, because she saw that coffin. Samuel Parris wrote in a letter later, in 1694, that means had been used in his family, unbeknownst to him or his wife, quote, to raise spirits and apparitions in no better than a diabolical way, unquote. Next, Tituba, Parris, and the afflictions. I think my words are going behind the picture instead of, yep, there it went. Do you see it? What's it say? I'll have to tell you. I think it's Tituba, Parris, and the afflictions, is what it said. It is unknown how long the occult involvement of Tituba and the girls had gone on, but by January 1692, some negative symptoms became evident, particularly morbidity, which is an obsession with death, and hysteria. So these girls that were participating in this began to think a lot about death, and also they became hysterical, just uncontrollable. Listen to what the description is. People that were there wrote this. Quote, they would creep into holes and under benches and chairs, put themselves into odd and unnatural postures, make wild and antic gestures, and utter incoherent and unintelligible sounds. They would be seized with spasms, drop insensible to the floor, or writhe in agony, suffering dreadful tortures, and uttering loud and piercing outcries. Does that sound scary? In fact, one reason that families stopped attending Parris's church was that, quote, the distracting and disturbing tumults and noises made by the persons under diabolical power and delusion, preventing sometimes our hearing, understanding, and profiting by the word preached, unquote. So a lot of people left Parris's church because these girls were during church making noises and doing things so that they couldn't even pay attention to what the pastor was saying. Now, Cotton Mather is one of the leaders of the Massachusetts colony. He's the first American to be elected to the British Royal Society and was one of the first to advocate the use of the smallpox vaccine when the rest of society regarded it as a dangerous practice. He also wrote one of the earliest known descriptions of plant hybridization. Cotton Mather says that the children were, quote, and so I'm pointing out that he is a reliable source. He's an intelligent guy. He's not some wacko, all right? He says the children were, quote, bitten and pinched by invisible agents. Their arms, necks, and backs turned this way and that and returned back again. So in other words, their arms, necks, and backs were turned ways that you normally can't do, and then came back. So it was impossible for them to do of themselves and beyond the power of any epileptic fits or natural disease to effect, unquote. Another author describes Elizabeth Parris's afflictions. Quote, early in her illness, Betty, which is a nickname for Elizabeth, seemed withdrawn and preoccupied with her own secret thoughts. She was also forgetful and began to neglect the chores she performed for her mother. She lost interest in almost all her customary activities, including worship, to the point of forgetting prayer and then rejecting the Bible when it was offered to her. Fits began in the same months. Dreadful convulsions accompanied by shrieking, screams, tears, and sometimes unconsciousness. Unquote. Another author, in his book published in 1692, same year that they occurred, described many of the afflictions experienced by the girls. He says often they were deaf and dumb, closing their eyes tightly shut during their fits. So when they were having one of these fits, they couldn't hear or speak. Sometimes they were afflicted at a dreadful rate, he said, when they were discoursed with about God, Christ, or salvation, acting outrageously. So when anyone tried to communicate to them when they were in fits about Christ or the Bible, the fits got worse. Sometimes, he says, they were able to tell from several miles away that someone else was being afflicted, which it was found later to be exactly the time and manner in which they related it. So they could tell that someone miles away, they could say, oh, so-and-so is being afflicted right now. And they would find out later, yeah, that was happening. And when they were asked, how did you know? They said that specters of the suspected persons told them of it. So in other words, they believed that there were spirits acting on behalf of people that were witches, and that those specters were communicating to the girls. Another instance, he tells, of an iron spindle of a woolen wheel. You know, one of those the wheels that you make wool. And there's a spindle on it, and there's an iron tip on it. It has strangely disappeared out of a house in the village. Apparently, it was being used by a specter as an instrument of torture to a sufferer, not being discernible to the standers-by. In other words, this person was being apparently poked with this thing by a specter, but nobody could see it until it was snatched out of the specter's hand by the sufferer. Then it immediately appeared to the persons present and identified as the same iron spindle that had been missing. Get the picture? In addition, on one occasion, Abigail Williams had a fit in her home, complaining of a severe stomach pain. When examined, there was found a pin in her stomach, with the pin pointing out. The pin was pointing out of her stomach, which means it had to have been initiated from inside. Mary Warren fell into a violent fit with a pin in her hand and blood running from the mouth. All right, so those are some of the things that were observed concerning what was happening with these girls that were under the tutelage of Tituba. We end at what time? 46. Okay. Now, tomorrow, we'll begin looking at the accusations of the girls, because there's obviously a problem. People know there's a problem. People are noticing what's happening. So the next question is, why is this happening? And when they ask the girls start making accusations as to who is causing it. And we'll look at that tomorrow. For tomorrow also, I want you to not do anything except look over your notes. The next reading assignment we'll hold off on unless you want to do it early. Any questions about what we covered today?
Oh yeah.